Now available in paperback and e-readers. Easteen, Little Girl Lost. The devilish diva helps a lost little girl find her way home in this devilishly funny Easteen series adventure. Get Easteen, Little Girl Lost in paperback and e-readers today. When I look at the failed diversity campaign at Marvel Comics, led by Axel Alonso and Tom Bevrot, I have to wonder if anyone at Marvel Comics did any research on their competition and their efforts to try to diversify their catalogs. Because I believe if you're Tom Bevrot and you're Axel Alonso managed to do some research of their competition, they would have taken a longer and harder look at DC Comics' defunct Minx line. Now, your DC Comics back in 2006 decided they wanted to try to reach female readers, and they wanted to try to capitalize on the popularity of manga with female readers. So they decided to launch the Minx line, a series of graphic novels that pretty much featured heroines and stories that featured more slice of life, young adult type tales. And they wanted to do this to try to reach female readers. And as part of this campaign to try to reach female readers through this Minx line, your DC Comics spent over a couple of $1 million to publish these titles and over $250,000 to pretty much advertise and promote those titles. And the result of all of that money spent, what happened at DC Comics as related to the Minx line is that the Minx line got pretty much poor reviews from many readers and even poorer sales. And the DC Comics Minx line pretty much folded by 2008. So I would have thought that your Axel Alonso and Tom Bevrot would have looked at the failure of the Minx line and thought hard about it before they went out here on this campaign to diversify Marvel's catalog by trying to appeal to women and minorities, because all anyone had to do was take a longer and harder look at that DC Comics Minx line to see what the result was going to be. And what was really sad about that DC Comics Minx line was that here was a line of comic books meant to appeal to female readers, and it failed abysmally. And that is in spite of a $250,000 advertising budget. And that $250,000 advertising budget, you can really feel the impact of it, because in spite of spending that $250,000 on advertising to promote this Minx line into bookstores and places where women are supposed to go, most people didn't even know this Minx line even existed, especially in the comic book communities. And that's what really has the most devastating impact about that all that money being spent. Because when you think about it, over $250,000 was spent to try to appeal to female readers, and most comic readers didn't even know this line of comic books even existed. So I look at that, and that's very powerful when you think about it. That much money spent, and you couldn't even appeal to the audience. And that's the type of research, sadly, that wasn't done at Marvel Comics before they went on this diversity campaign, trying to give us this female Thor, this female Wolverine, this black Captain America, this black female Iron Man, and this Asian Hulk, and all these other diverse characters, and then replacing the mainstream white male characters to do it. Because if they had taken that longer, harder look at that Minx line, I think they would have thought twice before they went on this diversity campaign that pretty much alienated their core customer base and led to these major declines in Marvel Comics sales. Because what a lot of people on these social justice warrior campaigns, what they'll do is they'll sit there and they'll complain about diversity, because I know this from personal experience as a publisher. They'll complain about the content in these books, but when it's time to spend money on these books, these people cannot be found. And this is the hard lesson that DC Comics learned, in spite of spending millions of dollars and a $250,000 advertising budget. And sadly, this is the same lesson that Marvel Comics is learning right now, as they pretty much have gone into this major sales slump, trying to appeal to audiences that pretty much talk a good game, but when it's time to spend money, cannot be found to spend the money. And this is what the big problem is with many of these of these social justice warriors as it relates to the publishing industry. They just don't understand that publishing is a business. And in a business, a publisher is out to make money. They cannot produce new titles unless they have a profit. And in publishing, it's a razor thin profit margin. So for a major publisher like Marvel Comics or DC Comics, or even a small publisher like myself, to go out here and launch a title, we need to see a profit on that title. We don't just publish titles because people say they want them. We publish them because they make money. And if you don't spend money on the product, the business has no incentive to go out here and make that product. And this is something your social justice warriors, your liberals, and many others just don't understand about the publishing business. Moreover, they don't understand the point that the publishing business has a razor thin profit margin. Even with corporate backers like Warner Brothers and Disney, your average publisher pretty much loses a lot of money on most of their titles. In fact, they lose money on 90% of their titles because 90% of published titles pretty much wind up failing every year. And because they wind up failing, they have to make money take the money from the 10% of titles that are successful to cover the losses on the 90. But what's happened in Marvel, thanks to their failed diversity campaign, is that they no longer have a core base of titles anymore to lay that foundation for maintaining profits in their publishing division. And when you don't have that foundation, you are going to be on a rickety platform as a publisher because those core titles like feature your Steve Rogers Captain America, your Tony Stark Iron Man, your Peter Parker Spider-Man, your Thor, these are the core foundation of Marvel's publishing division, and this is how they pretty much make their profits. If these titles don't sell, they don't make money, and they have to pretty much cover those losses. They have no money to cover the losses from these other titles. Now, I look at the comic book industry and from a panoramic perspective, and yes, there is a desperate need for diversity, but the way the comic book industry has been executing diversity is the big problem relating to it. Because as I see it, one of the things that they need to do to execute diversity effectively is to go out here and try to hire more people of color who are qualified to write comics and draw comics. And what's happening these days as it relates to Marvel and DC is that they're not going out here to hire more qualified writers, more qualified artists, and people who understand the craft of comic books. They're just picking up any random person who seems popular, like your Ta-Nehisi Coates or some of these other writers out here, and they're having them write comics, and they're not taking the craft of them very seriously. And because they don't take the craft of them very seriously, they wind up producing poor quality products that don't sell. Yes, they feature characters of color, but because they have poor quality stories, they don't sell. And that's no different than what went on with the DC Comics Minx line. Now, the DC Comics Minx line did the exact same thing that your social justice warrior diversity Marvel is doing right now. They're just creating characters of color or characters for girls, and they're dumbing things down. They're doing half-done stories, and their whole attitude towards approaching the projects pretty much is the reason why they have poor quality, because the attitude they have is that comics aren't their craft, comics aren't their priority, fantasy isn't their priority. They don't see it as something that's truly important to do. It's just a side job for them, and because it's just a side job for these type of writers and these type of artists, they put no heart into their work, and because there's no heart in their work, the reader has no reason to pretty much become personally attached or connect with these characters or connect with these stories, and they pretty much can't see themselves in the story, so they have no incentive to pretty much buy these stories on the regular. And this is why their diversity campaigns pretty much have failed. And if they were really smart, they would hire, again, qualified people, and the qualified people would not be sitting there talking about, let's make an Asian Hulk or let's make a Black Spider-Man. They would be talking about, let's use this existing catalog of characters who are of color and use them. Because Marvel Comics has a great catalog of existing characters. The same thing with DC Comics. There are characters in their catalog they can use. All it takes is a writer who has a mastery of craft to go out here and write that character in a way that pretty much makes them interesting. And this is the big problem with diversity. We have people trying to create new characters out of established characters instead of trying to use existing characters and trying to build an audience organically. And this is the biggest problem as it relates to the comic book industry overall. They don't want to try to build characters organically or try to create new audiences for a character organically. They sit there and they try to shock market you into getting attention by saying this is a black superhero, but they don't give you any substance behind it. And in order to sell books to any audience, whether it be women, minorities, or white males, you have to have substance, because substance is what gets people to continue buying a product, and that's what people want in their comics. They have been wanting great stories, and they've been saying this for years. Unfortunately, the comic book industry is still focused on flash instead of substance, and that's why it's been struggling on all fronts. Now, when I looked at Diversity Marvel, and I look at the failure of the Minx line, I see parallels between the two, and the parallels between the two have to do with the execution of concept. And this is another big problem with the comic book industry as related to things. They just don't know how to execute on a concept, because I look at the Minx line and the format for their books, and it could have worked had they executed the concept properly, had they brought in craftspeople to write really solid stories. The same thing with Marvel Comics as it relates to diversity right now. Had they went out here and really made an effort to write some solid stories, they would get the audience, they would get the sales, but you have to create great stories and pretty much give people a reason to spread word of mouth, because most comics are sold not through advertising campaigns and promotion campaigns, as we learned with the failure of the Minx line. In spite of that $250,000 being spent, they're sold through word of mouth. And a seasoned publisher like myself will tell you that books are sold through word of mouth. You don't sell a book through an ad. That may get people's attention for a moment by seeing something flashy on the cover, but if they don't see anything substantive between the pages, they have no reason to go out here and buy that book on the regular. And that's the big problem. That's the other big problem with the comic book industry. They're not focused on trying to build that audience of customers. They're thinking that they can try to appeal to these audiences outside of their core base, and not understanding that in your attempts to try to get their attention, you wind up alienating your core base. And you just can't do that. You have to have a plan that appeals to both audiences and really expands outside of the radius into the circumference. And when you have that plan, you can get all the customers, not just a small group of customers, because the SJW crowd, they're the ones who complain about things, but they're not the ones who put money on the table. And you have to focus on the casual customers and the customers who are out to put money on the table, sort of such as the people who just saw many of the Marvel Studios movies, not the people who are complaining. Because what I find with a lot of the complainers is that, from my own experience running SJS Direct, is that the people who complain the most are the ones, when you ask them to put the money on the table, they just don't show up. So you have to focus on the customers who want to be there and focus on appealing to them and keeping the product solid, not on the customers who pretty much are going to complain no matter what. And I look at comics and the whole diversity campaigns, and we really just need people, again, to focus on it from a more structured basis and a more organic basis, such as focusing on diversity as in hiring creators of color and hiring qualified creators of color, because qualified talent is going to come in and they're going to make characters stand up in a way that gets new readers, and they're not going to just write or slapdash anything and just say, oh, I created a character with a woman in it, or created a character with a minority in it, and then it winds up failing. And that costs the company money, and that costs the company market share. And that's something that the guys at Marvel really need to think about, because, again, If they had taken a longer and harder look at DC's Minx line, they would have understood what mistakes not to make in trying to diversify Marvel Comics. If you like what you see on this channel, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. And if you want to try some of the SJS Direct titles, such as the ISIS series or the East Team series, you can do so by clicking the link to the Amazon.com in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.